before. The smile has been erased by that protective piece of cloth worn over the mouth and nose. Today, in the absence of a cure and a vaccine to keep away the novel coronavirus, we know that this piece of protective cloth or face mask save lives. We may be, if it may be one of the reasons you and I are still capable of carrying on this conversation today. Then again, it is a conversation mediated by the magic of new technology. In our hands are lightweight devices and equipment that have the intelligence to sense our voices, carry them in real time over vast distances, and even create a virtual presence for each of us, as they do today, by the magic of turning picture elements or pixels into our own images. Indeed, today, seeing the decay of old institutions, something is being destroyed in order that we can rebuild. We have accepted this as the immutable law of existence. But I believe that there is something precious among us that is pandemic, that this pandemic will eclipse. It is the oneness of humanity, the idea so ingrained in our DNA that we are one and capable of goodness, and that we humans, as the author Rutger Bregman has argued, thrive in a crisis, and that our innate kindness and cooperation have been the greatest factors in our long-term success on the planet, quote unquote, his words. I dare say that the worst times we have seen at the pandemic are the best times when we have seen our values come shining through, none more relevant today or more inspiring than the value of cooperation. 2 weeks ago, I delivered the remarks at a consultative forum on the Belt and Road Initiative, which the Communist Party of China organized with several Philippine political parties, the biggest of them being PDP Laban, of which I am the Vice President for International Affairs and Head of the International Department. I proposed then that we take the Belt and Road Initiative to a higher level of commitment and cooperation amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Our idea is for the BRI to become truly meaningful in the difficult passage, to be turned into a regional vehicle that will spur major economic rebuilding and recovery programs. Through this forum, the Association for Philippines-China Understanding, let me reiterate briefly my proposal for China to lead in the launching of COVID-19 Recovery Fund. At the end of 2020, when the experts will choose which word has had the most impact on the peoples of the world during the year, three words will be prominent at the top of the heap: lockdown, self-quarantine, and recovery. When the old multilateral institutions will begin to awaken, recovery will be the product of regional cooperation. Neither of our two nations can deviate from this imperative. The COVID-19 Recovery Fund will become a linchpin of this heightened cooperation. With vast resources at its disposal, China can make recovery happen and happen at a rapid rate, focusing on two areas: infrastructure and healthcare in the affected economies around the world. A bilateral technical working group will trace responsibilities of this fund, which we can then set in motion at the earliest possible time. It is our hope and wish today that China casts a positive eye on this idea as a good neighbor, friend, and co-stakeholder in the region. This is the best of times for a new level of cooperation between our two countries to develop. There is no other person in the Philippines who can help us realize this with the People's Republic of China than our good ambassador, who is our keynote speaker today. So let me welcome you all. Welcome, Ambassador Chito. First, Apcu. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman Raul Lambino. Before we proceed, let me cite the ground rules. Please, all participants, please refrain from put your mic to the mute form. Only the president, the chairman, the moderator, and the speaker will be the one to answer, to unmute. So the next will introduce, the next speaker will we will introduce our main speaker, Vice Chairman Sixto Benedicto.
Allow me to thank you, Pete. Allow me to introduce our speaker for the forum today, His Excellency Jose Santiago L. Santaramana, fondly called as Chito, assumed his post as the Philippine Ambassador to China in March 2017, and he is also the non-resident Philippine Ambassador to Mongolia and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Before his appointment as ambassador to China by Philippine President His Excellency Rodrigo Duterte, he worked as a broadcast journalist in China for the news division of the American Broadcasting Company. He has lived and worked in China for almost 4 decades. He was the former president of the Philippine Association for Chinese Studies and a professional lecturer on Chinese politics and foreign policy at the Asian Center, University of the Philippines. He was also active in track 2 diplomacy and participated in several international conferences on the South China Sea issue in Vietnam, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, China, Belgium, and Italy. He served as a special consultant to former President Fidel V. Ramos on August 2016, when Ramos held talks in Hong Kong with senior Chinese officials as President Duterte's special envoy. This historic icebreaker meeting paved the way for the successful state visit of President Duterte to China on October 2016, which brought about a dramatic improvement in Philippines-China relations. As ambassador, he has accompanied President Duterte during his talks with President Xi Jinping. He was also a member of the Philippine delegation to the bilateral consultation mechanism of the South China Sea. He graduated from De La Salle University, studied Mandarin in Beijing, and obtained a master's degree in international relations at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in Massachusetts. Without much ado, may I present our speaker for our forum today, His Excellency Ambassador Chito Santaramana.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to discuss with all of you the current state of bilateral relations between the Philippines and China. When the Apcu president, Jeffrey Nan, invited me, I said what I want to do is not give a lecture, but rather to exchange views with Apcu members and with officers and members, and to keep it as active and as free-flowing as much as possible. So I will just give this introductory remarks and open the floor for discussion, because I know you have a lot of questions. Because the last time I was invited to give a talk on Philippines-China relations in Manila, I prepared a PowerPoint and I got so carried away and I spoke for so long, there was hardly any time for discussion. Learning from that lesson, I thought I'd do it the other way around and open the floor for questions and answer your questions, because what is important to me is not only to exchange views with you, but more important is to know your questions and your perceptions on the state of Philippine-China relations, as well as your points of interest, so that I could direct my answers to that. So without much ado, please feel free to come up with your questions. Does anybody want to break the ice?
Can I ask something, Mr. Ambassador? Mr. Henry.
Hi, Henry.
Hello, can I ask the first question, Mr. Ambassador?
Sure. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was asked from some of the government officials in China regarding the recent announcement of our Foreign Secretary, Teddy Boy Locsin, regarding the 4th anniversary of this arbitration rules. Of course, they were alarmed that we are repeating, citing the results of arbitration. They are asking me whether if this has a blessing of the president or not. Can you give us some, at least something regarding this one so that I can answer them?
Sure. Thank you for your question, Henry. And I'd like to begin by saying that actually yesterday, Secretary Locsin had a video conference with Foreign Minister and State Councilor Wang Yi. And they discussed the state of bilateral relations, including the issue of the arbitration award. It was a frank and friendly exchange of views. The bottom line is this. Secretary Locsin expressed the same views to Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and Wang Yi also explained the Chinese position. And it was a very frank discussion on that there are differences between the two countries on this issue. But the bottom line is both sides agreed to disagree. We recognize that we have different positions on this. But despite these differences, that both sides agreed to maintain friendly and cooperative relations and to continue and deepen the bilateral relations between the two countries. Secretary Locsin's statement actually is consistent with what President Duterte told President Xi Jinping himself when President Duterte was here in Beijing last year, in August last year, July and August last year, actually, the end of July, almost a year ago. And at that point, President Duterte brought up the whole issue of the arbitral award and the Philippine position. And President Xi, of course, also explained the Chinese position, and the two sides agreed to disagree. So I think you should look at it in this context, that Philippines-China relations, there are two aspects, two sides to it. There is the areas of cooperation, areas where we don't have disputes, and second, there are areas where we have differences of views, areas where we have disputes. As for the areas of cooperation, we proceed and try to fast track the areas of cooperation as much as possible. As for areas of dispute, we try to discuss our respective positions and try to resolve it. If we cannot resolve them, we try to manage them. So these are the two tracks in Philippines-China relations. The areas of cooperation, of course, outweigh the area of differences. So Secretary Locsin, as he explained it to me and to Foreign Minister Wang Yi yesterday, was that he made that statement last Sunday because of the anniversary of the arbitration award and to restate the Philippine position. But he also recognized that the Chinese position is different. And so the two sides agreed to disagree. And in the meantime, to continue with the friendly relations. So it does not signify a change in our policy towards China, but that it does signify an important point. On areas where we want to cooperate, where we can cooperate with China, we cooperate as much as possible. But on areas involving our sovereignty, our sovereign rights, and on areas of principles, we stand our ground. and we explain our position. If you take it in that context, what Secretary Locsin expressed last Sunday is basically a continuation of this policy. It may represent a slight recalibration in the sense that we not only talk about the two sides, but there is no fundamental shift in our friendly policy towards China. That's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for the clarification.
Ambassador, I have a question. No? At the start of this administration, the president went to China, and there was supposedly something like $15 billion in investments and $9 billion in loans. Would you give us a status on the $15 billion investments that are supposed to have been made by Chinese companies in the Philippines?
This is October 2016, if I'm right. At
Yes,
that point,
that's right.
we were talking in terms of 9 billion in terms of loans and 15 billion in terms of proposed investment projects.
That's right.
The loans, we're a third, almost a third, because there is the Chico Dam, there is the Kaliwa Dam, there is the railway project. The railway project is going to cost about 3 billion. And the money is still there, but it's waiting now for the loans to be finalized and for the projects to be pursued. As for the 15 billion investments, as you know, China is now the leading investor in the Philippines in terms of approved investment for the past 2 years. But I don't think we've reached the 15 billion at this point. We're over the halfway mark. There are a number of other big investments that has to materialize. It's in the process. One is the telecom project. Now, exactly how much that will reach, that's at least $1 billion, if not more. And then there are other big projects, which unfortunately, due to COVID, is now on a standstill. There is a large steel mill that they're talking about. There is an industrial park at the Clark New City that is being near the finalization stage. So I think the progress of these investments have been affected by COVID. So what we're hoping is that after COVID, and that's one of the points yesterday, by the way, in the conversation between Wang Yi and Secretary Locsin, they want to restart the priority infrastructure projects so that it can be completed. Given the situation of COVID, since we're unable to predict when it will end, it's difficult to say. 2, 3, I think, of the ones that are nice in Mindanao, that's beyond to be able to restart and complete as much as possible in the remaining time, over 2 years. As for the other investments, I think when the industrial park is done, that could be a major source of investment too, as well as when the telecom project is completed. As you know, there is a timeline for the China Telecom to provide the investment and the technology for DITO, and it's been extended till the end of the year as a result of COVID. So it's hard to give a definite answer in terms of what's in already. The only thing I can say is based on BOI figures, for the past 2 years, China has become the leading source of approved investment in the Philippines.
Okay, we have a question. There's another question, no? From Hubert Chua. He wants general sentiment, read the U.S.-China rivalry in China and the Chinese government. What do you think is our official position and how do we want to maneuver?
Okay. Okay, this is a good question. And this is actually a very relevant issue, right? Issue of the strategic rivalry between the US and China. I think we should look at it that this strategic rivalry will constitute the strategic framework wherein we will operate in terms of our foreign policy for the foreseeable future, not only up to during this administration, but beyond. And the question is, how do we position ourselves? We position ourselves right now under the rubric of what is in our constitution, an independent foreign policy. And I want to explain that in some detail. The 30 administration's implementation of independent foreign policy has several components. One is that we no longer follow everything the US does, or we try to be independent of US, that our strategic interest is not identical with the US. Neither is our strategic interest identical with China. We have to define and to recognize our own strategic interests. And what is that? To preserve the survival of our nation, to preserve the independence of our nation, and to ensure the development of the Philippines. So what we want to do is to be friends with both. We want to maintain the traditional friendship with the US, but maintain independence from the US. We are no longer a colony of the US, nor do we want to be a neo-colony of the US. In terms of China, we want to maintain friendship and cooperation with China, but neither do we want to be a pawn or a tributary state of China. So what we want to maintain is to carve a bigger strategic space between the two, and to maintain a strategic space where we can enlarge our room for maneuver. Essentially, what it means is that where we can cooperate with China, we try to cooperate as much as possible. Where there are disputes with China, we stand our ground and we maintain our position, and if necessary, to push back in terms of diplomatic protests, of statements, and so on. In terms of the US, we maintain our traditional friendship. We maintain our alliance, our defense alliance. But where there are encroachments or infringement on our internal affairs, on criticism, on internal domestic issues, there we will push back. So that is how we intend to pursue this. The other component of the independent foreign policy, of course, is to maintain ASEAN centrality. In other words, ASEAN, basically, our unity with ASEAN constitutes the foundation of our foreign policy. First of all, it is unity and solidarity with our immediate neighbors, and that's ASEAN. And then beyond that is friendship with and cooperation with other major powers in the region, like Japan. We intend to continue having good relations with Japan, with South Korea, with India, with other countries in the region. And another component, of course, is to have good relations with the other major powers, like Russia, EU, the European countries. So those are the major components that within the framework of an independent foreign policy. We expect the relations between the US and China in the immediate future to most likely worsen. But we want to play a constructive role we hope the two sides, China and the US, can still resort to negotiation and we want to promote the dialogue between them so that they can discuss the issues. They should have differences and try to avoid any actions that will affect the stability, the peace and stability in our region. From the point of view of the Philippines, though, it is necessary, I think. We basically have two weapons. One is diplomacy. And that is why we want to exert as much as possible all our efforts in diplomacy, because diplomacy, in a sense, is a form of political warfare without bloodshed. So if we can avoid bloodshed, the best weapon we have is diplomacy. The second, of course, is deterrence. We have to strengthen our own deterrence capabilities, because in the end, we will have to rely on our own efforts. Of course, we have an alliance, we have allies. So, of course, we would welcome all their support and all their assistance. But we want to be inclusive. We want support and assistance from China, from the US, from Japan, South Korea, Russia, Europe, ASEAN, from all over the world. And the compass we use in navigating our foreign policy is our strategic interest, our own national interest, which is guided by the Philippine Constitution and by international law.
Ambassador,
So that is how we
yeah, thank you. There's a follow-up question. What
Yes?
does the Chinese government, do the Chinese people...
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
What does the Chinese government and what do the Chinese people think of the US now with the increased rhetoric of Secretary Pompeo and President Trump? Can you hear me?
Wow. The US now is, if you read the Chinese media and talking to Chinese diplomats and Chinese friends, the relations are at their lowest state, and the US is viewed now as trying to contain and to hold China down. And as a matter of fact, it's trying to bring China down. I had this discussion with a Chinese intellectual, and he gave me this analogy. He says that what the US is trying to do is similar to what Reagan did to the Soviet Union. At that point, Reagan tried to use the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars, to try to promote an arms race. And that actually, the Soviet Union didn't have the capability, and it eventually led to its collapse. What the US is doing is, on the technology front, deny China, microchips on South China Sea also to try. It's basically to pressure China on all sides. But of course, the trade war is the leading weapon that the US used. The overall point is to shake China and see if it will collapse. But that, of course, is a sort of an extreme view. But I think what we're going through right now is a test for China. Can it withstand the pressure exerted by the US and the West, actually, at this point? The advantage of China, of course, it has a big domestic market, so economically, it can still stand. The question, though, is whether it can still grow and continue on its growth trajectory. A recent survey of about 100 Chinese scholars or Chinese researchers, specialists on US-China relations, they did a survey which was published in the Chinese media. More than 60% already say that it is a new Cold War that the US is waging on China. But over 90% of them said that they'll be able to withstand this. So this is what we're watching closely and what we should watch closely. how China will be able to withstand the pressure, what will happen to the Chinese economy, because that is the foundation. I mean, if the Chinese did not develop economically and they were still where they were in 1989 or 1990, there is no such problem that we're seeing now. It's because China is already number 2 in terms of economic strength. And the leading power, the US, it seems to me it's quite clear they're not willing to be number 2 to China. So they're trying all their best to keep China from overtaking the US. China has still a long way to go in terms of per capita GNP and strength. It has a long way to go. There's no way, it is not written in stone that China will overtake the US. But where I think the US is quite fearful is one of if the economy keeps growing and China can still, even in overall GNP as opposed to per capita, can exceed the US in relative terms and not in PPP or purchasing power parity, but in terms of actual exchange rates, because that is still the way to compare economic strength. If China were to lead economically, technologically, and militarily, then of course the US, because you see, the problem is we went through a unipolar period. When the US, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US was at the top of the heap, was the number 1 and the only one 10 years. It is no longer a unipolar world. It is a multipolar if you count Russia. Although Russia cannot match China in terms of the economy, although it still has superior to China in terms of strategic missiles. I think what the US basically is saying, particularly in its statement on the South China Sea, is that it will not give up the primacy. It's the American primacy in the South China Sea. You see, after the Second World War, and particularly after the Vietnam War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, in a sense, the South China Sea was an American lake. And what the Americans are saying, there is no way they're going to allow it to be a Chinese lake. The problem now, though, is can you have a new balance of power between the two, in which China Sea or in the Western Pacific? And this is actually the interesting question that is worth watching. What will happen in the next few months and the next few years? Because here we're seeing it's really a contest for primacy. And hopefully this. Any other questions?
Yeah, there's another question from our former president, Gabi Lopez. No, how is the COVID
Yes.
situation in China, in Beijing? Is there any vaccine that will be available soon?
Well, first, the COVID situation. Actually, they're now on their way to basically keeping the situation, to controlling COVID here. The past couple of weeks, we're down to single digit in the whole country. In Beijing, the past 8 days, it's down to 0. However, the experience in China has shown that even after Wuhan and after Beijing had 0 infection for 2 months, all of a sudden there was a cluster of infection from a wholesale market. And it's still not clear what the source is, although the suspicion is on some food item. In the beginning, the suspicion was on imported salmon. So for a while, we couldn't eat sashimi here because everybody was afraid that was the source, and the Chinese stopped importing salmon from Norway, from Europe and Latin America. But I think basically it points that there is always a potential of a second wave if one does not watch out. So that is why it's important to develop a vaccine. There are several vaccines being developed in China. One is already in trial use, but only limited to the Chinese military. In a sense, they have developed this, the military academy has developed a that they're now using at an advanced stage, but only for the Chinese military. We're waiting for the results of that one. And then there's another one, there's one that's being developed. And they're also doing a joint experiment vaccine with a vaccine there. So Brazil and China have cooperated on that. In the conversation, the phone conversation, I believe it was in late April, the President Duterte made a request to President Xi that when the vaccine is ready, he hopes it can be shared with the Philippines. And President Xi agreed that the Philippines would be a priority when the Chinese vaccine has already been approved for use, and that they will do it as a commercial public good. In other words, so that it won't be like a auction where the highest bidder will be able to buy it. I think they'll basically have a priority markets and try to distribute it at a reasonable cost. So we're hoping for that, and we're watching closely. They're talking about possibly by the end of the year knowing the results, or early next year. But we're still a couple of months off. In the meantime, the trial phases are going on very intensively in China. And as I mentioned, they had an agreement with Brazil because that's one of the hot spots right now. So they want to try it there too.
Okay. We have a question
Next
from
question.
our own Secretary, Percy Peralta. Ambassador, now that the U.S. has rejected formally China's territorial claims in the South China Sea, what would be its effect on our own security in case there will be war between the two superpowers, considering the close distance of Chinese military installations
First,
to the Philippine shores? Did you hear me, Ambassador?
the second part, sorry.
What would be the effect? What would be the effect?
The last part I heard was about war.
Yeah, what would be the effect on our security if there
the
will be
audio
war? If there will be war between these two superpowers, considering the close proximity of China's military installations in the South China Sea to Philippine shores?
I see. Okay. First of all, the American statement is on maritime claims, not on territorial claims. So the American position on territorial claims, like on Pagasa, even on Scarborough, I mean, I wish because Scarborough, that was under American jurisdiction. During the colonial period. That's why I was surprised that the Americans did not extend to that extent, but I guess they knew that would be a bigger issue. What the Americans did was to say they support basically the arbitral award and its ruling support basis. Now, this would be to inform how the Chinese react, expect on how the Chinese react and what the Americans do it without any incident proceeded. If they're to maintain it in that way, then of course they will control. I don't think the US and China want to go to war on this issue. What they'll try to do is manage it. But let's go to that prospect. I think what we want to do is actually to prevent war. And that is why we want to play a constructive role, and we want to tell our American friends and our Chinese friends, talk about it, resolve it, manage your differences. But I think what the Americans are doing is, of course, this is from their point of view, this is part of their range, the array of measures they're taking to try and pressure China. The question now really is how the Chinese say, because hypothetically, an oil exploration platform in the South China Sea and the chance, it is conceivable that the American military or the American Navy will now be in the horizon or will be in the immediate horizon. And the question is how the Chinese will react to this. So a lot bears watching. What we hope to do is not to have a war, but if there were to be a war, that we don't want to be involved. We don't want to be entangled in it. And we certainly don't want to participate in such a war. The question really is how to promote peace in the region, peace and stability in the region. It's a complicated issue, but we want to exercise the whole range of options, from diplomatic, legal, political, and of course, use our good offices to be able to convey messages to either side so that communication lines remain open and that so they can manage the situation. If, as a result of this, it could lead to the resolution of the disputes, the maritime disputes, that would be a way for it to result in conflict or war. Now, however, from my experience as a journalist here covering China, I covered what happened during the Hainan plane crisis in 2001. And that is actually what unfortunately happened. And I hope it doesn't happen again, but I think it could happen again, because there are, as the Americans increase their reconnaissance flights, particularly over Hainan and over the South China Sea, the question is how the Chinese will react. In 2001, so hopefully it won't happen. But I won't rule out the possibility that there could be such an incident, a miscalculation, an accident, and it could lead to a political and diplomatic crisis. But a diplomatic crisis is better than an all-out war. At least with diplomacy, it's still like warfare without bloodshed. And we want to avoid further bloodshed or any bloodshed over the South China Sea. Next question.
Yeah, before we go on, we'd like to acknowledge the presence of Senator Coco Pimentel, who is also chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We have a question from Stevenson Ang. Can our government follow up on the case of the PRC Maritime Militia ramming of MV Gemvir, the fishing boat? Those who are responsible should be held liable. Now, the Chinese government is very clever to force it through their fishing association, a civilian agency, to avoid any official connection.
This is the phishing
Yes,
incident last year, right? The
yes, that's
sinking
right.
of the fish.
That's
Okay.
that's right. That's
Okay.
right.
Yes, actually, in terms of the embassy here, we've already done the best we could. So we were able to secure an apology from the captain from the company actually, and an assurance that compensation would be paid. What we're waiting for, and this is I'd like to explain what the situation is right now. An insurance claim the filing of a claim for compensation, which should not, the Chinese can easily repay that. I can tell you, I mean, $1 million, $2 million, it's chicken feed for the Chinese, but we have to file. And this is where I think the problem is. It was explained to me when I was following up this case that it is between the DFA and DOJ. Basically, DOJ, this is a legal procedure. So you need the expertise. And I think Secretary Guevara has already delegated it to the extension, their office, the local offices. They have to interview the fishermen, get the estimate of losses of the owners and the fishermen. Because not only should compensation go to the owners of the boat, but also to the fishermen who were waiting there for an hour in the ocean at the risk of life. So it's not, of course, the equivalent of life insurance. The ecological damage is one, and the other one is the economic loss of the compensation for a business loss. You know, the fish that get sold, the months they were waiting, you know, because they didn't have a boat. So somebody has to put that into some sort of an estimate and file it and submit it. And we're waiting for that. So the follow-up, actually, we'll follow up with authorities in the Philippines, but the follow-up is there. It's here. The Chinese reminded me that they're waiting. And the problem really is we have to submit an insurance form. It's not that, you know, they'll just give any amount. You have to, you basically have to do it like when your car gets wrecked. You have to file a claim. And that's what we're waiting for right now. So it will be done. It's a question of time. It's a question of bureaucracy. COVID got in the way because I knew they were working on it. And, you know, when I went home, the last time I was there, January, February, I couldn't go home. I couldn't go back since then because of COVID. It was in the works. But then when COVID happened, I guess people couldn't go to the offices and so on, whatever, resulted in all this delay. But Secretary Locsin was also asked the question when he came out in an interview in the Philippines. And he followed up to that, and that's why Secretary Guevara, DOJ, is now working on it. Next question, if any.
Yeah, another question from Austin Ong. How would you advise Apcu members and friends to help in promoting for understanding and peace, especially amid the flood of fake and biased news that aim to derail the gains in Philippine-China friendship?
Well, there is a lot to be done in terms of clarifying the situation. But let me first explain the basic problem. The basic problem, I think, is the strategic framework is the U.S.-China rivalry. So there are forces at work here. And in the case of the Philippines, it's very clear. The colonial mentality is very strong. And the influence, the American influence on the media, on propaganda is very strong. But at the same time, in China, there's a problem of the wolf warrior diplomacy and soft power. So that is a weakness. So as a result of all this, you have all this information. I think the first thing among Apcu members is to educate yourselves. You know, first of all, I think you have to be clear. You know, what you're reading, who's writing it, what framework is coming from, whether from a Chinese propagandist or a U.S. propagandist, and then how to situate yourself on what is the Filipino viewpoint. But I think the key is still back to the facts, back to the basics. As I used to do when I was a journalist, it might help. You read the American media and you read the Chinese media, the truth is somewhere in between. The same with the Philippine media. In other words, don't believe everything you read. You have to process it. You have to compare it with your own experience. And then you need a compass. And the compass really is, what is the Philippine interest? Because otherwise, it's a battle of the mind. And all the forces involved in this geopolitical battle are trying hard to win over the hearts and minds of everyone. The key is really how to develop independent thinking, independent analysis. So I would recommend highly that read as much as participate in such discussion. One thing that's very useful, I think, is to watch or to participate in such forum, particularly Q&A, particularly debates, because then you start your view of the situation, you know, the issues, what the pros and cons are, because only then will you be able to sharpen your sense of judgment. And it's never easy. The other thing to do is to know that there is a spectrum. There is a hard line, there is a moderate, and there is the pros and cons. To be able to situate when you're reading an article, where is this coming from? What is the target audience? And so you don't just swallow everything hook, line, and sinker. But basically, I would suggest being exposed to a range of experts. Like what you're doing. I mean, inviting different resource persons so that you hear different points of view and you can compare. Because it is only then that you can see. But as I said, usually the truth is somewhere between the two extremes that is usually you're being exposed to. And the problem is to be able to discern and to discern carefully.
Okay. We have another question. Ambassador, what is your comment on the assertion of some people, even high-profile individuals here in the Philippines, asserting that the Philippine government should assert its territorial rights in the West Philippine Sea? They are saying that the country should defend its territorial rights in the first place.
Actually,
is it correct?
the answer is very simple. We agree.
Yeah. Okay. So you agree with the statements of Justice Tony Carpio?
Okay. To assert territorial and maritime rights, we agree completely. Sorry, the audio is off. Wait. Are you still on?
Yes, we're on.
Can you hear
we can
me?
hear you. Now we can hear you. Yes.
I can't hear anymore. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'll proceed. Let me proceed. On the issue of asserting territorial and maritime rights, we agree completely. And that is the work we are doing here. The difference, I think, is we are asserting it diplomatically and peacefully, as opposed to doing it in a confrontational manner. And I think that is where the difference is. If the point is to fire our shots, to go to war with China, the answer is no.
we would like to use that as the last resort. What we want to do is to exert the whole array of tools under diplomacy, under law and diplomacy, and to assert it by doing it without bloodshed. And that is why I say diplomacy is warfare without bloodshed. This is our preferred weapon. This, and those who say, well, I agree with some points that Justice Carpio has raised. What I disagree with is the confrontational approach towards China. We want to use a diplomatic approach in asserting our territorial and maritime rights. And it is a case in point. Let me just go through it and so that you have an idea of what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is this. The maritime features that are under our control and that are occupied by us, we do not want to give up an inch of those. And we try to do that through negotiations, through diplomacy, and through diplomatic notes. It is also necessary to build up our own deterrence capability. So that is why we try to improve on the maritime features under control. That is why Pag-asa, we're trying to repair the runway. That is why we built the port there, which wasn't done for decades. And despite Chinese objection, but we basically have reached a modus vivendi with the Chinese. One, no reclamation of Scarborough Shoal. Preserve it as a fishing area. No blockade on Ayungin. Before, we couldn't supply. We couldn't send supplies there. We couldn't even resort to landing supplies there or airlifting supplies there in the past. We have an understanding with the Chinese that the supply lines are open. The major point of difference, though, is that the Chinese originally wanted to take out the ship there, to force it out. And we've been able to persuade them, let it be. But of course, the Chinese now will react if we were to build something permanent on Ayungin. This is the point of contention there. The second is in Sandy Cay. Sandy Cay, as you know, it was not there a couple of years back, but because of the movement, the geological movement, it surfaced, and so it is between Pag-asa and Subi Reef. So we would like to preserve it as our territory. The Chinese, of course, contest it. They say, if you build there, we will react. So right now, both sides are watching, but it is unoccupied. But it is within range of Pag-asa and within our, certainly we're watching within our monitoring range. So basically, there have been red lines drawn that don't go beyond this, and they won't go beyond this too. And usually the problem is when it is near that area. You know, Pag-asa, the first important thing is to understand what we are claiming, and what our position is that the Kalayaan Island Group is part of Philippine territory. The Chinese position is that the whole Spratlys, including the Kalayaan Island Group, is their territory, and that is why there is that conflict. But if you do it that way, we don't want to lose more territory, and that's why we want to do it through an assertive diplomatic posture. And we do it through a combination of quiet diplomacy with the Chinese, through the bilateral consultation mechanism, Of course, there is a strawman argument that has been built up that this is not enough. Well, this is the point of contention. Our point of contention is that we're doing the best under the circumstances, as opposed to the confrontational approach that will lead to more losses. We lost Scarborough Shoal because of wrong tactics and a confrontational approach. When the Chinese tried to, when we were having a standoff with the Chinese, what is important is to understand the Chinese mindset. If you make a mistake, they will pounce on you. There is no room for error. And so if you try to make a military move, if you cannot sustain it, chances are you will lose simply because they're stronger. So given the current situation now in the South China Sea, I think it bears watching what will happen in the next few months. But we hope as the strategic rivalry escalates, that it will not lead to a wider or bigger conflict, but that it could serve as a point of reflection for both sides, for the US, for China, that they want to resolve this through more discussion or more consultation, or at least to be deterred and just keep the situation as is and not make further expansion or further advance or further moves that could escalate the situation. Because given the current balance of power in the region and the current situation between the US and China, it is quite possible that any wrong move could result in a wider conflict.
Thank you. We have a question from Senator Coca Pimentel. Ambassador, how is the Philippine national interest in foreign relations determined? Is there a think tank or group within the DFA for this? And upon the determination of the Philippine national interest in a specific issue, how is this position communicated officially to the people?
Well, the answer is very simple. It's in our constitution. Foreign policy is really a decision of the chief executive. The chief executive is the chief architect of our foreign policy, but the chief think tank of the foreign policy is the DFA. DFA organization, and they study the situation very carefully. The role of the Philippine embassy and my role here is really to be able to size up, to pick up all the information we can get, to understand the Chinese thinking so that we can convey this to the DFA. The DFA is the chief advisor to the president on foreign policy. Of course, the foreign secretary, the DFA is the chief advisor and also the chief implementer of foreign policy. There are three pillars in our foreign policy. One is, of course, national sovereignty. Second is the welfare of overseas Filipinos. And third is, of course, to promote the economic interests of the country. And so in case of the Philippine embassy here, we do work on all that, political, that's in terms of handling the political relations with China, economic diplomacy in terms of promoting trade and investment and tourism. And then there are OFWs here and how to further promote their interests, particularly in this COVID situation. There are several hundred Filipinos stranded here who either they lost their jobs because of COVID and therefore they want to go back, but because there are no direct flights and because the price of tickets, the very few tickets available are very expensive, they've been waiting for months and we're trying to help them. There are also quite a number, over 100 seafarers hired by Chinese fishing companies waiting. They're stranded in the high seas near Fujian and they're again the companies they lost their business, or they don't have much work, so they're stranded out there. And the Chinese authorities here don't want to let them disembark because of the strict rules on COVID. So they're gonna be brought back to the Philippines in a boat, hopefully in the next week or so. But those are the three pillars. So how it's communicated? It's communicated through the foreign policy is communicated through what I'm telling you now. First of all, through what the president is saying, and through what the spokesman, the foreign secretary, and the office of the spokesman, the presidential spokesman, Harry Roque. So for foreign policy, basically the chief spokesman is the president. And then there's a foreign secretary. And then there's the presidential spokesman. My role is not here, and the foreign secretary is not here. I think the key problem really is the arbitral award. We want China to comply with it, of course. But the problem is China is not willing to comply. So what do? Do you declare war in China? Of course you cannot declare war. You try, of course, to mobilize all the resources you can. And you try to do it through diplomacy, to try to convince the Chinese that the two sides can agree on. And that basically is what we're trying to do. People may think the progress is slow, but if you look back on 2016, as I remember before I assumed the office, we were then talking about that Scarborough would be reclaimed of diplomacy because of help from allies. That has been prevented. We talked that at that point that Chinese would declare an ADIZ. It has not been declared, and up to now, that's currently still the issue. We're trying to prevent that the Chinese will declare this. One thing you have to understand with China, they have all these options lined up. You know, when they built the artificial islands, that wasn't done in a rush. They had all these ideas earlier. It was an option, but the moment we filed our arbitration, their response was to build the artificial island, because if we won, then that certainly is part of what we were claiming. And now it makes it difficult for us to claim. So the problem really is how to make them comply. And the problem is, it is gonna be a long-term problem. It is not gonna be solved soon, and I don't expect it to be solved. I mean, there are people, and I follow the social media, who say that, why doesn't the US nuke China to solve the problem? That won't solve the problem, because the Chinese will also nuke the other side, and we'll all end up in a nuclear war. So there is this desire. Why doesn't China become democratic so that it's easier to talk? There is that it's wishful thinking, you know. We should go back to the real world. Unfortunately, the real world is not an ideal world. We have to deal in a world where there is a symmetry of power, and where we are a small, or at most a middle power. We may be punching beyond our weight, not because of Pacquiao, but because of how we're maneuvering in our geopolitical situation. And if we are clever, if we are nimble in our diplomacy, as we're trying to be, we could take advantage of our geopolitical situation. So we're trying to find the geopolitical middle ground that will give us benefits, maximize the benefits for the country. While dealing with these problems, the problems we can solve right away, we will try to solve. The problems that will take more time, we'll try to manage. That then we will lose some island or some feature. And the basic goal right now is not to lose any feature, and to build and improve on the features that are under our occupation and under our control. Yes, if you have more questions.
Yes, we have one question. What is the next step in the bilateral consultative mechanism in the South China Sea? From Dr. Romel Banloy, President of Philippine Association for Chinese Studies. And what is the status of the Memorandum of Understanding on Joint Development of the South China Sea?
Okay, that's a good question. As you know, we have this bilateral consultation mechanism, the BCM. It basically is our bilateral talks with the Chinese. This is where we discuss all these sensitive issues, you know, Scarborough, Spratlys, Pagasa, Ayungin, Sandy Cay. This is where this is all discussed. We hold it every 6 months. The last one, we've held 5 already under the Duterte administration. The next one was supposed to be in the first half of this year. Of course, all of that has been delayed now because of COVID. And the next one, we're trying to see if we can we can resume it in the second half of this year. In the meantime, that we cannot hold it, we're trying to use this virtual approach, you know, through online, but it's not easy to do it. So basically, the embassy has played the role of the channel. All the issues recently, you know, involving in the West Philippine Sea have gone to the embassy. We actually here in Beijing, because of COVID, we haven't had any meeting with the Chinese face to face. It's always been on the phone. We call each other almost on a daily or every other day basis. And it's very active, and we write out our reports to the Foreign Secretary, to DFA, for them to look at and to keep the communication going. Now, the oil and gas, we already were at the stage where we had the MOU and where we formed the intergovernmental. Basically, it's a DFA and DOE, the Department of Energy. And they had the first committee meeting was held last October, end of October, early November. And the plan was to hold it again the first half of this year. And of course, because of COVID, it couldn't happen. So the plan right now is this, to try to resume it in the next couple of months when COVID is, when China actually is ready, and we're trying to arrange what is called a special channel so that possibly Chinese officials can go to the Philippines or Philippine officials can come to China without having the COVID test, but without the 2-week quarantine. That's the situation now. But the basic development is that Forum Energy and the CNOC have continued meeting, and they're talking in terms of, you know, service contract 72. But it's still at the point of view of exploratory discussion. So at this point, it is not yet available. Not yet. It's still in the process. Mr. Moderator, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hear me?
Yeah. We can hear you.
2-minute break. I'll come back. It's because I have to take care of something. I'll be back in a minute or two. I'll keep.
Okay. So we'll have a short break until Ambassador Chito Santa Romana comes in. Those who would like to ask questions, just put it in the chat. We will try to accommodate as many questions as possible with Ambassador Chito. But of course, we cannot ask um, all your questions. No, it will take too long. I'm proud that our Apcu members have a lot of incisive questions to ask Ambassador, covering geopolitics, Cold War, even South China Sea issues. It's quite enlightening considering the depth of experience and knowledge of Ambassador Chito. No? For those who came in late, Ambassador Chito lived in China for more than 40 years. He was among those student journalists who were trapped in China during the declaration of martial law. So he had lived and worked in China for more than 30 years. And he is as familiar with the Chinese people as the Chinese themselves. So we are very lucky to have Ambassador Chito as our ambassador to China. And I'd like to invite everyone here to become a member of Apcu, the Association for Philippines-China Understanding. This was established during the 1970s when our Chairman Emeritus, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, and the original founding members went to China even before the Philippines had established ties, diplomatic ties with China. So there were the forerunners in promoting people-to-people understanding and relations between the people of the Philippines and China. So we will be coming up with more such forum in the months to come. Yeah, Ambassador. Here's a question. The POGOS in Manila has been an economic boon especially for real estate people. No, unfortunately, it has also brought some social and cultural friction between the Chinese workers and the Filipinos here in the Philippines. No, what do you think is the position of the Chinese government towards POGOS, and has this been a headache for you?
Actually, the POGOS is an issue that it's sort of when I joined the government and on the issue of Philippine-China relations, I didn't expect the issue of POGOS. Actually, it was an unintended consequence of the improvement of relations that came out. I mean, in a sense, it blindsided me. But I couldn't figure out at the beginning where are these people coming from, because we issue the visas here, in China. We don't issue work visas. We hardly issue work visas in Beijing because it takes a long time. Only people in the diplomatic service or ADB or it's executives. POGOS never applied for the employees who are working in the POGOS never applied. I never encountered that. So we tried to hold that was discovered. They basically took advantage of the promotion of tourism, group tours. You see, group tours are now allowed. Excuse me. Are promoted, but to prevent the tourists from China from staying in the Philippines, the travel agency have to pay a bond. I think it's with the DOT, the Travel Tourism Department. I think it's a million or a couple of 100,000. So that if somebody stays and doesn't return, they lose the bond and they lose the license. Now, so we were trying to figure out how are they going around this rule. Apparently, there is an exception if the return to China was able to stay in the Philippines because he had a work permit or even a temporary work permit, as long as there's a local work permit, Philippine work permit, then it is not their responsibility. So that is the loophole in a certain government offices. It became a racket, I mean, basically. So that explains how those then stayed. Aside from those, there may have been quite a number, but I think quite limited of those who entered illegally. But having said that, the question now is what to do. Basically, if you ask me personally, it's to enforce the laws on the powers, tax them, make sure they're legal permits, make sure they have the legal documents to stay, the work permits. And but your question is about China. China's position is very clear. This was actually a point of discussion. It wasn't a headache. It became a headache when the Chinese took a position, because up to 2018, when President Xi visited, I remember having a discussion with the Chinese ambassador then. And I was the one asking him, because he was in Manila, I was here in Beijing. Can you do anything about these POGOs? I mean, because my impression was these were, Chinese businesses in the Philippines. And he was actually, he was telling me in a friendly way that, these are very powerful people with strong economic interests. And if you oppose them, your life is basically going to be at stake. And that's when I said, is it that bad? And of course, I started reading more about it. But I was having a feel of the situation when the Chinese government started to have a crackdown on overseas gambling of Chinese, and of course, it not only is part of the anti-crime campaign in China, but before that, just to give you more background, when they had the anti-corruption campaign in China, one of the targets was, of course, Chinese officials gambling in Macau. So Macau was the first one to be hit, and that's why it developed all these. That led to the development of all these online, where you cannot trace anymore the people who are engaged in gambling. And this government sometimes came out with their announcement. And I remember when I heard it, that I said, actually, this is a case where, in a sense, the president took an independent position, a clear independent position of China, and he explained to President Xi that it will affect our economy if we were to do that in one swoop. So that for now we cannot crack down. You can proceed with your crackdown, but in the Philippines we will, because of the economic impact, it will have to be done slowly. So basically, on the part of China, since then, they've been going after the ones that are there. It's a it's a crackdown that they use, and I think it has escalated under COVID, and in the subsequent months. This will see a decline in the go setback here, or in the business fortunes. They'll have to because the Public Security Bureau now is very strict in terms of investigating, those who applied for passports and tracking down. So there have been press reports in China of a crackdown on pogos, and the ones that have been affected are those who came back for a short vacation and were going to go back to the Philippines. They've been stopped at the airports. But the crackdown here is, of course, largely driven by the economic factor. The Chinese economy is going through difficult times, and they want to stop the outflow of money. And that is one problem with the pogos, the outflow of currency from China. So I expect that this will have an impact on the pogo business. But they're very tricky. If you're in China and if you try to look for a gambling site, you can't just Google or Baidu in China. It's not Google, but you use Baidu. You can't just Baidu. You can't find it. But if you have a Chinese cell phone, then you get these invitations. Join this. It's like first it's a simple game, numbers game, and then you pay a certain amount, then you go down to another level until you hit the highest level and you're in the pogo. But they call the online gambling. Now, of course, under COVID, online is the name of the game. So I don't know how successful they will be. But even in a country with a great firewall, they are having a hard time in controlling the firewall for pogos. It's actually, well, because they use, it's not direct to the Philippines. They use third countries, or third or fourth country in the Caribbean or somewhere in Europe, in Eastern Europe, or even some said at the border with North Korea, with Vietnam, with Laos, with Cambodia, with South Korea. So the people here, their business interests are quite deeply entrenched, and of course, it's a source of easy money, and it plays on the whole psychology of gambling, and affinity somehow towards. So I could say. More questions?
Yeah, one
Is
question.
the audio signal clear?
It's now clear, yes. Do you sense a rising ultra-nationalism among the Chinese people, and also rising anti-China sentiment among the Filipino people? Is this a cause for worry?
Well, both are true. Within China, given this, new type of Cold War that's developing in the U.S. and China, and as well as with the Western countries, there is a West anti-U.S. feeling. But this is when Xi Jinping speaks about making China great again, or rejuvenating the Chinese nation, he harks back to the century of humiliation.
Ambassador?
Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Am I back?
Yes, you're back.
Okay. Let me pick up So Xi Jinping, when he speaks of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, he harks back to the century of humiliation when the Western powers, U.S., Japan, and Europe, basically colonized China. So unfortunately, the same array of forces are, under different circumstances, are now, are now sort of joining in chorus against China. So unfortunately, you have this clash in perception. So on the point of the Chinese, the rise in nationalism, ultra-nationalism, on the part of the West, of course, the anti-China thing has increased. And in the part of the Filipinos, yeah, the anti-China feeling, partly I think because of pogos, partly, mainly, perhaps mostly because of the China's actions in the West Philippine Sea. It is a cause for concern because in the end, foreign policy depends on public support. If there is no public support, then the foreign policy changes. But the public support in terms of foreign policy is measured not only by public polls. The key determinant, if you ask me, is the presidential election. Because whoever gets elected the president, whoever becomes the president, if he wants to change the balance in our system, and there are of course those who can. Under Duterte, he came in with this of a gut feel that our relations with China are badly strained. We should improve this, and that the Americans, especially when the push factor came in and the criticism of the US came in, that became like a push factor. And of course, because given the current world situation, it really is a multipolar world and that we have to develop relations with all. There is a recalibration as you go along the way, depending on the situation, depending on the concrete circumstances. But going back to your question on the perception, yes, I follow the public support, the opinion polls, the distrust. But we don't do foreign policy basically just on the opinion polls. We do it on the determination, particularly by the president, based on the analysis of all the facts and data that we put in on what is in our national interest. And that is the role in a presidential system. The president gets to determine from his perspective what to promote the national interest. But of course, there is the Senate and there's the Congress to chime in and to support, to second the motion, so to speak, or to veto. In the case of treaties, you have to go through the Senate. So basically my answer is that it is a cause for concern, and ultimately the foreign policy is that the level of public support for, and he's determined to continue to stay the course in terms of foreign policy. We'll have to see as a result of the next election and the evaluation of whoever will be the president then, because the public support for foreign policy ultimately will have an influence on the election. Although my own reading of the situation is that it's the domestic situation that determines the result of the election. Foreign policy plays a secondary role. Can you still, are you still?
It's a bit choppy. It's a bit choppy. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Now we can hear you. Yeah.
Are we still on?
Yes, off and on. Off and on. Anyway, Ambassador, can you hear me?
Can you?
Ambassador Chito?
Can you hear me?
It's a bit off and on.
Okay. Now, okay. So the signal is we go through a VPN here. Any other? Yes,
Anyway.
I can hear you.
Okay. Anyway, we
Okay,
have.
now I can hear you. I can hear
Okay.
you. Oh,
Thank
it's
you.
choppy.
Thank you for answering all our questions. We have
Can you hear me now?
already. Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can
Okay.
hear you.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you, Ambassador, for answering all our questions. No, we have detained you for 1.5 hours already from your busy job. Thank you for agreeing to the first time to speak to us in a Zoom meeting. We appreciate that you immediately agreed to have a Zoom meeting with us. Our man in Beijing knows the Chinese as much as they know themselves. No? We have seen that Ambassador Chito is very well conversant with world history, Chinese history, geopolitics, the diplomacy and current events in Asia. During this new Cold War between the West and China, his job is more difficult than ever. Trying to balance the competing interests of the US, China, and the Philippines. But no doubt, Ambassador Chito is up to the job and he will do us proud. We in the Association of Philippines-China Understanding will always be promoting closer people-to-people ties, better friendship and understanding between the Filipino people and the Chinese people. We stand fully beside Ambassador Chito and will always support him in the next 2 years to come. Again, thank you, Ambassador Chito. Thank you, fellow Apcu members and friends, for attending today's Zoom meeting for 1.5 hours. We look forward to more Zoom meetings in the months to come. Wait for our announcements in the next couple of weeks for our next Zoom meeting. Again, thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope we have gained a lot of knowledge from Ambassador Chito. Thank you everyone and good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Chito.
Bye.
Thank you, Chairman Raul. Thank you, Senator Coco Pimentel.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Congratulations, President Jeff, and to all the members of the team who made this.
Thank you. Thank you, Percy.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cynthia, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank
Pit,
you. Till our
remind
next
mo yung iba, yung
speaker.
event bukas pala sa Marikina. Yola, yung invitation ni Chairman Emeritus. Kung sino yung libre, mapumunta doon. 2
Yes,
o'clock.
it's Congressman ng baby, Pizarro. Chairman Emeritus GMA is requesting for he's hosting a mass for our past president Rene Velasco at Loyola Chapel, Marikina. Please be there at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you, President. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chef.
Thank you. Oh, hi, Mary.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.
Brother, nakalimutan natin banggitin yung token of appreciation natin. Oo nga.